Welcome to a history chapter, where today we're diving into one of the most pivotal moments in American history, the Battle of Gettysburg. Over 3 days in July 1863, the fate of a nation was contested on the rolling fields of Pennsylvania. This battle, often cited as the turning point of the American Civil War, saw the Union and Confederate armies clash in a conflict that would determine the very soul of the United States. The Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865, was primarily fought over the issues of slavery and states' rights. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, on a platform that opposed the expansion of slavery into the new territories, precipitated the secession of 11 Southern states and the formation of the Confederate States of America. The war began when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, shortly after Abraham Lincoln's inauguration as president. The conflict quickly expanded, with both sides mobilizing large armies and engaging in battles that ranged across the country, from the East Coast to the Mississippi River and beyond. The early years of the war saw a series of Confederate victories in the Eastern Theater, under the leadership of generals such as Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. However, the Union held significant advantages, including a larger population, more industrial resources, and a navy that could blockade southern ports, gradually strangling the Confederate economy. By 1863, the war had evolved into a grueling contest of attrition and maneuver, with each side seeking to break the stalemate that had come to define the conflict. The Confederate Army, under the command of General Robert E. Lee, had achieved notable successes in the Eastern Theater, including victories at the Second Battle of Bull Run and Fredericksburg. These triumphs, however, were offset by significant Union advances in the Western Theater, notably the capture of Vicksburg, which gave the Union control over the Mississippi River and effectively bisected the Confederacy. Amidst this backdrop, Lee embarked on his second invasion of the North in the summer of 1863. This bold maneuver aimed to accomplish several objectives. By transferring the theater of war into Union territory, Lee hoped to relieve the besieged state of Virginia, which had borne the brunt of the conflict, to disrupt the North's economic infrastructure, to procure supplies for his beleaguered forces, and perhaps most ambitiously, to deliver a crushing blow that would sway public opinion in the North towards peace negotiations and possibly secure foreign recognition and support for the Confederacy. The first campaign was the unsuccessful Maryland Campaign of September 1862, which ended in the bloody Battle of Antietam. This battle gave Lincoln the opportunity to block the recognition of the Confederation as a separate state by the governments of Great Britain and France. However, this time the Confederates hoped of securing independence through a decisive victory on Union soil. The invasion of Pennsylvania was intended to threaten northern cities, create unease among the civilian population, and force the Union Army into a defensive posture from which it could be defeated in detail. On the Union side, the response to Lee's invasion was marked by a change in leadership, with Major General George G. Meade taking command of the Army of the Potomac mere days before the battle. The Union's strategic imperative was clear: to repel Lee's invasion and, by doing so, maintain the momentum achieved in other theaters of the war. The stakes were high, with the very survival of the United States and the fate of millions of enslaved individuals hanging in the balance. Thus, as the two armies converged on the small town of Gettysburg in early July, they were not merely engaging in another battle, but were instead contesting the future direction of the United States. The clash at Gettysburg would emerge from a confluence of strategic imperatives, military tactics, and the deeply entrenched divisions that had led the nation into civil war. In June 1863, Lee began his northward push, crossing the Potomac River and entering Maryland before advancing into Pennsylvania. His army, numbering approximately 72,000 men, including 10,000 cavalry units and 270 artillery guns, was organized into 3 corps, commanded by Lieutenant Generals James Longstreet, Richard S. Ewell, and A.P. Hill. The Union Army of the Potomac, tasked with defending Northern Territory and defeating Lee's invasion, was under the command of Major General George G. Meade. Meade took command on June 28, 1863, just days before the battle, after his predecessor, Major General Joseph Hooker, was relieved. Despite the sudden change in leadership, the Union Army was determined to engage Lee's forces and halt their advance. Meade's army, comprising about 94,000 soldiers and 360 artillery pieces organized into 7 corps, was spread out but quickly mobilized to meet the Confederate threat. The Union's strategy was reactive. Meade needed to protect Washington, D.C. and Baltimore from potential attacks, and also sought to engage Lee's army under favorable conditions, preferably on ground of his choosing. The initial movements leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg involved a complex interplay of reconnaissance, cavalry skirmishes, and marches. Both armies were spread out across a wide area, with their movements obscured by the terrain and limited intelligence. Confederate forces moved north through the Shenandoah Valley and then eastward into Pennsylvania, while Union forces marched northward, parallel to the Blue Ridge Mountains, in an effort to maintain a position between Lee and the major northern cities. The lead-up to the battle was marked by uncertainty and chance encounters. Confederate General A.P. Hill sent his division to Gettysburg on July 1st, searching for supplies, particularly shoes, not expecting to encounter a significant Union force. However, Union cavalry under Brigadier General John Buford had arrived in the town, establishing positions to delay the Confederate advance. This unexpected engagement between advance elements of the two armies on the morning of July 1st set the stage for the larger battle to unfold. Neither Lee nor Meade had planned to fight at Gettysburg, but the movements of their armies, dictated by logistics, reconnaissance, and the need to protect or threaten key locations, converged at this point. The strategic intentions, the march routes, and the decisions made in the days leading up to July 1, 1863, inadvertently selected Gettysburg as the site where the critical battle would take place, shaping the course of the Civil War. The battle began when Confederate infantry, part of Hill's corps, encountered Buford's dismounted cavalry west of Gettysburg. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Union cavalry put up a stubborn resistance, utilizing the terrain to their advantage. Their tenacious defense was aimed at holding the Confederates back until Union infantry could arrive on the scene. By mid-morning, elements of the Union First Corps, led by Major General John F. Reynolds, began to arrive, reinforcing Buford's cavalry. Reynolds quickly engaged the Confederates, but was tragically killed early in the fighting, a significant blow to the Union command. Despite his death, the Union forces fought on, with Major General Abner Doubleday taking over command of the I Corps. As the day progressed, more units from both armies poured into the area. The Confederates, reinforced by Lieutenant General Richard S. Ewell's corps from the north, and additional brigades from Hill's corps, continued to press the attack against the Union forces, which now included elements of the Tiffmont Corps under Major General Oliver O. Howard. The first Union infantry to reach the battlefield was the I Corps, commanded by Major General John F. Reynolds. Reynolds quickly recognized the importance of holding the high ground and moved to reinforce Buford's cavalry, engaging Confederate forces in a series of fierce encounters. The fight for control of key positions, such as McPherson's Ridge, Hare Ridge, and Oak Hill, intensified as more units arrived on the field. Tragically, General Reynolds was killed early in the fighting. Command of the Union forces on the field then fell to Major General Abner Doubleday. Despite this setback, Union forces fought determinedly to hold their positions. As the battle progressed, additional Confederate forces arrived, including elements of Lieutenant General Richard S. Ewell's corps from the north, adding pressure on the Union right flank. The Union forces found themselves fighting a defensive battle on multiple fronts as Confederate numbers increased. Ewell's arrival on the battlefield added new vigor to the Confederate attack. The Union's Wampum Corps, positioned to the north of the town on Oak Ridge and along the Mummersburg Road, faced a difficult situation as Confederate forces launched coordinated assaults. Despite their valiant efforts, the Union defenders were gradually outflanked and overwhelmed by the superior numbers of the attacking Confederates. By the afternoon, it became clear that the Union forces could no longer hold their positions outside Gettysburg. The I and Sixth Corps were forced to retreat through the town, suffering heavy casualties and chaos in the streets. Confederate forces pursued them closely, but were unable to break the Union's final defensive line on Cemetery Hill, a strong position south of the town where the remnants of the Union forces regrouped. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, sent by General Meade, arrived on the scene and took command, organizing the defense on Cemetery Hill and preparing for the arrival of the rest of the Army of the Potomac. His leadership helped stabilize the Union position and set the stage for the next 2 days of battle. The first day of the Battle of Gettysburg concluded with the Confederates in control of Gettysburg and the Union forces holding the high ground to the south along Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill, and Culp's Hill. Although the day ended with a Confederate tactical victory, the Union's strategic position on the high ground would prove decisive in the days to follow. The engagements of July 1st resulted in significant casualties on both sides, setting the tone for the intense and bloody fighting that would characterize the remainder of the battle. General Robert E. Lee sought to capitalize on his initial successes by attacking both flanks of the Union Army. He believed that aggressive assaults would break the Union lines and force a retreat, potentially leading to a decisive Confederate victory. To this end, he directed Lieutenant General James Longstreet to attack the Union left flank, while Lieutenant General Richard S. Ewell was to assault the Union right flank. Major General George G. Meade, the Union commander, anticipated that Lee would try to attack the flanks of his army. Meade had skillfully positioned his forces along a fishhook-shaped series of high ground extending from Culp's Hill on the right, along Cemetery Ridge, to Little Round Top on the left. This defensive position provided the Union forces with significant advantages in terms of height and the ability to shift reinforcements along interior lines. One of the most critical engagements on July 2nd was the fight for Little Round Top, a rocky hill on the Union Army's extreme left flank. Recognizing its strategic importance only hours before the Confederate attack, Meade ordered Brigadier General Gouverneur K. Warren to hold the hill at all costs. The timely arrival of the 20th Maine Regiment, commanded by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, played a decisive role in defending the hill. After repelling multiple assaults, Chamberlain ordered a daring bayonet charge that successfully pushed back the Confederate attackers, securing the Union's left flank. Nearby, fierce fighting erupted at the Wheatfield, Devil's Den, and the Peach Orchard. Longstreet's corps launched a series of brutal assaults against these positions, which were initially defended by the Union III Corps under Major General Daniel Sickles. Sickles had moved his corps forward from the main Union line to occupy what he perceived to be higher ground, creating a salient that became a focal point for Confederate attacks. Despite initial resistance, Union forces were eventually forced to retreat from these positions after suffering heavy casualties. The second day of Gettysburg ended with significant losses on both sides, but without a clear victory for either. The Union Army maintained its strong defensive positions on the high ground, while the Confederates captured some territory but failed to break the Union lines. The failure of Lee's flanking attacks set the stage for the final day of battle, with both armies preparing for what would become the climax of the Battle of Gettysburg. The fierce combat on July 2nd demonstrated the determination and bravery of both the Union and Confederate soldiers, highlighting the intense divisiveness and the high stakes of the Civil War. The third and final day of the Battle of Gettysburg, July 3, 1863, was marked by one of the most famous engagements in American military history, Pickett's Charge. This day saw the culmination of General Robert E. Lee's attempt to defeat the Union Army and potentially turn the tide of the Civil War in favor of the Confederacy. However, the events of July 3rd would instead solidify the Union's defensive victory and mark the beginning of a turning point in the conflict. General Lee's plan for July 3rd was centered on an all-out assault on the center of the Union lines on Cemetery Ridge. He believed that after 2 days of intense fighting, during which the Union flanks had been heavily engaged, the center might be vulnerable to a concentrated attack. Lee ordered a massive artillery bombardment intended to soften the Union defenses, followed by an infantry assault by roughly 12,500 men drawn from Lieutenant General James Longstreet's 1st Corps. This assault would be led by Major General George Pickett, along with divisions commanded by Brigadier Generals J. Johnston Pettigrew and Isaac R. Trimble. The Confederate artillery barrage began around 1 p.m. and lasted for nearly 2 hours, one of the largest of the entire Civil War. The bombardment aimed to damage Union artillery and infantry positions, but due to poor aim and the inefficacy of the Confederate shells, much of the fire went over the Union lines, causing fewer casualties and less disruption than Lee had hoped. Following the artillery duel, the Confederate infantry began its advance across the open fields between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge, covering approximately 3/4 of a mile under heavy artillery and rifle fire. The Union artillery, conserving its ammunition during the Confederate bombardment, unleashed devastating volleys on the advancing Confederates as they approached. Despite the heavy fire, the Confederate brigades pressed on in what is now known as Pickett's Charge. The attackers reached the Union line at a few points, most notably at a copse of trees and a low stone wall, which served as the focal point for the attack. Here, intense hand-to-hand fighting occurred, with Confederate forces momentarily breaching the Union defenses. However, without sufficient reinforcements and under continuous fire from flanking Union positions, the Confederate assault ultimately faltered. Pickett's charge resulted in massive Confederate casualties, with over half of the attacking force killed, wounded, or captured. The failure of the charge marked the end of Lee's campaign in Pennsylvania and represented a turning point in the Civil War. In the aftermath, Lee was forced to withdraw his army back to Virginia, ending the Confederate invasion of the North. The Union's successful defense on July 3rd was a testament to the strength of their positions and the leadership of officers like Major General George G. Meade, who had taken command of the Army of the Potomac just days before the battle. The Union forces demonstrated remarkable resilience and tactical acumen, holding their ground against repeated Confederate assaults. The third day of the Battle of Gettysburg underscored the determination and sacrifices of both the Union and Confederate forces, leading to over 20,000 killed by both sides and 12,000 missing, captured by the Confederate side. On July 4th, recognizing the untenable situation and the need to return his battered army to Virginia, Lee began the arduous process of retreating across the Potomac River. The retreat was hampered by heavy rains, swollen rivers, and the challenge of moving thousands of wounded soldiers, along with a long wagon train of supplies. Despite these difficulties, the Confederate Army successfully crossed the Potomac back into Virginia by July 14th, largely due to the cautious approach of Union Major General George G. Meade, who did not aggressively pursue Lee's forces. This decision was later criticized by some in the North, including President Abraham Lincoln, who believed Meade missed an opportunity to destroy Lee's army and end the war. However, the Union victory at Gettysburg had profound implications for the Confederacy and the overall course of the Civil War. Gettysburg marked a turning point in the Civil War, shifting the momentum firmly in favor of the Union. Coming just a day after the Union victory at Vicksburg, which secured control of the Mississippi River, Gettysburg dealt a double blow to Confederate hopes for victory. Lee's defeat meant the end of Confederate invasions into Northern territory. Future Confederate operations would be largely defensive, aimed at resisting Union advances in the South. The victory at Gettysburg, coupled with the capture of Vicksburg, greatly boosted Northern morale. It demonstrated the capability of Union forces to defeat Lee's previously invincible army and made clear that the North was committed to the war's continuation and to the restoration of the Union. The success strengthened the position of President Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, helping to ensure continued support for the war effort and laying the groundwork for Lincoln's re-election in 1864. The Union victory reinforced the shift in war, aims towards not just preserving the Union, but also ending slavery. This shift had been marked by the Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln on January 1, 1863, which declared all slaves in Confederate-held territory to be free. Gettysburg, coupled with the fall of Vicksburg, fundamentally altered the conflict's trajectory, setting the stage for Union victory and the eventual abolition of slavery. Thank you for joining us on A History Chapter as we journeyed through the pivotal moments of the Battle of Gettysburg. We've witnessed the courage, the strategy, and the sacrifices made by those who fought on both sides of this historic conflict. As we reflect on the events of those 3 days in July 1863, let us remember the lessons they teach us about unity, liberty, and the cost of freedom. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more episodes diving deep into history's most fascinating chapters. It helps us create historic content. Keep exploring the past, and see you next time.